Have you ever wondered what life would be like if one day you had to face major changes without anyone warning you beforehand? A true story about this grandma. I've had enough. How I reclaimed my worth. The heart of the home. A mother's love. Ellie always thought of her home as more than just four walls and a roof. It was a place of memories, love, and heart. In that three-story colonial house tucked away in Vermont, she had raised her son, Ben, watched him grow, and experienced both the joy of new beginnings and the sorrow of final farewells. The faded green shutters and the creaky wraparound porch, which always had a certain charm in the spring, were more than just elements of the house to Ellie. They were woven into the fabric of her life. It was the place where Ben had taken his first steps, where he had his first heartbreak, and where Ellie had nursed her husband through his last days. Harold, her late husband, had built their life together in that house. He had painted walls, planted roses in the garden, and put in long hours to make sure the house felt like a home full of love, of memories, and of family. But as the years passed, Ellie had grown accustomed to the idea that life, much like a house, constantly shifts and changes. The home where she had raised Ben was now about to be handed over to him. She didn't hesitate when Ben asked her for the house. The request didn't feel sudden or out of place. Instead, Ellie thought of it as a way of giving Ben a legacy. It seemed like the natural thing to do after all. This was the place where he had grown up, a place he had cherished. She smiled when she handed over the keys, thinking of all the memories they had shared there, the life they had built. But even as she handed over the house, Ellie kept a part of herself tucked away. There was a small detail, an unfinished deed. She had never quite completed the paperwork, leaving it just one signature short. It wasn't because she didn't trust Ben. It was because she knew that love didn't always protect you from being erased. In the back of her mind, Ellie knew that one day this house would be her final reminder of everything she had once held dear. She couldn't shake the thought that perhaps the house, this home, was the last thing she had to hold on to. It wasn't the first time Ellie had given something with all her heart. Throughout her life, she had given freely, whether it was making meals for Ben, folding laundry late into the night, or staying up with him to finish a history essay he had forgotten to start. But even with all her sacrifices, she never asked for anything in return, and she never expected anything to change, at least not in the way it did. When Ben and his wife, Tessa, first moved into the house, Ellie felt like it was a new beginning. She had offered to stay in the guest suite on the first floor, thinking it would give them all some space. She could still be part of the family, but with her own privacy. And for a while, it worked. She helped paint the nursery, cooked meals for Tessa during her pregnancy, and even stayed up late folding baby clothes. Ellie felt useful again, and for a time, she thought she was mom again. It was as though the house full of memories was welcoming her back into a familiar rhythm. But over time, Ellie began to feel like an outsider in her own home. It was subtle at first. A bookshelf was replaced, her teacups were boxed up and donated, and the garden bench that Harold had loved so much disappeared. Each change seemed insignificant on its own, but together they began to chip away at Ellie's sense of belonging. Her place in the home seemed to be slipping away, slowly but surely. Tessa, always with a smile, explained the changes, saying things like, "We're just streamlining, Ellie. Less clutter, more calm." Ben nodded along, but his eyes were always somewhere else. Ellie couldn't help but wonder if the house still smelled like cinnamon to him, or if the scent of eucalyptus candles had replaced every memory she had lovingly created. But Ellie stayed silent. She didn't speak up because she wanted it to work. She wanted to believe that the love she had given, the sacrifices she had made, would eventually come full circle. Even when Ben and Tessa wanted to renovate the kitchen, Ellie stepped in, offering to help. She pulled from her retirement fund to contribute to the renovation, though the amount wasn't significant, just $42,000, but it mattered to her. It was her way of showing that she was still there, still part of it all. In return, she heard them tell a friend, "We're funding the renovation ourselves. It took some smart investing." Ellie didn't say anything. She simply marked the date in her journal. Slowly, Ellie began to write things down not because she was forgetful, but because she needed to remember. The small dismissals, the slow erosion of her place, weren't insignificant. They were the deepest cuts, the ones that were hard to feel until it was too late. It was in these quiet moments, as Ellie watched the subtle changes in her home, that she started to realize she wasn't just losing her place in the house, she was losing her place in the family. Her presence was being rebranded as an inconvenience, something that didn't belong anymore. But she stayed quiet. Ellie wasn't afraid. She simply didn't want to rock the boat. She believed that love given freely, again and again, would eventually come full circle. But deep inside, Ellie was beginning to understand that the changes weren't about new furniture or renovations. They were about erasing her presence from the family's story, and that realization, though painful, would soon lead her to make a decision that would change everything. A generous gift, the house transfer. As Ellie stood there, looking at her son Ben with a smile, handing him the keys to the family home, she couldn't help but feel a bittersweet mix of emotions. Giving Ben the house, a place filled with memories of his childhood, felt like the right thing to do. It wasn't just about passing on bricks and mortar. It was about giving him a legacy, something that held the essence of their family, their shared experiences, and the life they had built together. But what she didn't realize in that moment was that the act of giving, no matter how much love was behind it, could also be a form of loss. Ellie had always seen the house as a symbol of their lives together, the place where she had raised Ben, where Harold had passed away, and where they had shared so many important moments. So when Ben asked her for it, her instinct was to say yes. The house was hers to give, and she had no hesitation. It was her way of showing love, of passing on the home where so much had happened. But there was more to it than just handing over the keys. Even though Ellie trusted Ben, she wasn't entirely blind to the complexities of human nature. She knew that love, no matter how pure, wasn't a safeguard against being erased. So she had kept a part of herself hidden, a small detail, something simple but significant. Ellie had never completed the deed transfer, leaving it just one signature short. It wasn't because she doubted Ben. It was because she had lived long enough to understand that sometimes even the best of intentions can be misinterpreted, even forgotten. It wasn't about trust. It was about caution, about leaving room for the unexpected. She had seen it too many times before, families torn apart by greed, misunderstandings, or simple neglect. So Ellie kept that unfinished deed close to her heart. It wasn't a sign of distrust. It was a small, quiet reminder to herself that nothing was ever truly certain. Love didn't always protect you. The decision to give Ben the house was supposed to feel like a graceful passing of the torch. Ellie imagined that she would always have a place in Ben's life, in the house. After all, this was still her home too. She had raised him here after all. But as the days passed, the house didn't feel quite like her own anymore. It was subtle at first. Small changes. Ben and Tessa moved things around, replaced old furniture with modern pieces, and gradually started filling the house with things that didn't hold the same sentimental value for Ellie. The home where she had poured so much love and effort slowly started to feel like it didn't belong to her anymore. One day, she noticed that the bookshelf she had painstakingly built was gone. In its place stood a sleek glass and metal modern piece. It didn't feel like the warm, welcoming house she had spent years crafting. Her teacups, which had once lined the shelves with their delicate hand-painted designs, were boxed up and donated without a word. The garden bench where Harold had spent hours reading and relaxing, his favorite spot in the yard, disappeared as well. These weren't just pieces of furniture. They were symbols of her life, of the life she had lived there, with Harold, raising Ben. Tessa was quick to explain these changes, always with a sweet smile on her face. "We're just streamlining, Ellie. Less clutter, more calm," she would say, as if her words could erase the deep, invisible wounds that each change left behind. Ben would nod along, his eyes always somewhere else, distant. Ellie couldn't help but wonder if the house still smelled like cinnamon to him, or if the scent of eucalyptus candles had taken over, erasing all memory of her and her careful, loving touch. But she didn't speak up. She didn't complain. She wanted to believe that everything would work out, that if she gave enough, if she stayed quiet enough, love would eventually circle back. She wanted to believe that her place in the family, her place in the house, would always be there. But with every passing day, it felt a little less like her home. Still, Ellie tried to stay patient, even when the house continued to change. Tessa started replacing things in the kitchen, adding modern, eco-friendly appliances, and making renovations without consulting her. At first, Ellie offered to help. She always did. She contributed a small amount from her retirement fund, not because it was a large sum, but because it was her way of saying, "I'm still here." But then, when she overheard them telling a friend, "We're funding the renovation ourselves," Ellie didn't speak. She simply marked the date down in her journal. It wasn't a huge amount, just $42,000, but it meant something to her. It was her way of showing that she was still part of the family, still involved, still willing to contribute. But for them, it didn't matter. Soon after, things started to feel more strained. Ellie was asked to use the downstairs kitchen less frequently, and when she did, it was with the understanding that she should stay out of the way. "Can you maybe take the attic room for the weekend?" they'd ask. The attic, once a place where she stored old winter coats and vinyl records, had now become the only place left for her. Ellie accepted, thinking it was just temporary, that things would get better. But with every small change, she began to feel the weight of it. She was being edged out. The quiet dismissals kept piling up. Tessa invited friends over without telling Ellie, and one day, Ellie walked downstairs to find strangers sipping cocktails in the living room. "Oops," Tessa said with a laugh. "Should have texted." Ellie didn't say anything, though she felt her chest tighten. She was still there, in the house she had given to her son, but it didn't feel like her home anymore. Ben and Tessa hadn't kicked her out, but they had certainly made her feel like she didn't belong. They hadn't thrown her out, but they had erased her in small, invisible ways. Each yes she gave, each time she stayed silent, chipped a little piece away from her. But Ellie, for some reason, continued to stay. She stayed because she wanted to believe in the goodness of her family, in the love she had given. She stayed because she couldn't shake the hope that it would all turn around, that love, in the end, would bring her back into the fold. But as time went on, Ellie began to realize something she hadn't understood before. This wasn't just about renovations, or furniture, or even the house. This was about her place in the family, and that, it seemed, was slowly being erased. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about whether or not she mattered. Fan 3. A subtle shift. The first signs of change. The first signs of change were subtle, barely noticeable at first. Ellie didn't realize the extent of the transformation until she started paying closer attention. It began with the small things, objects being replaced, furniture moved, and the gradual disappearance of items she had cherished for years. But with each change, a little piece of her presence seemed to slip away from the house she had built with her own hands. Ellie was no stranger to the passage of time. She knew that homes evolve and that people grow, but this felt different. This wasn't the natural evolution of a home or family. It was the silent rebranding of her place in the family's story. She began to wonder whether Ben and Tessa still saw the house for what it had been, a home filled with love, memories, and history, or whether it had simply become a space to be molded into something new, something that didn't include her. One of the first changes Ellie noticed was the bookshelf in the living room. It was a sturdy, handmade piece of furniture that she had built herself years ago. It held family photos, mementos from Ben's childhood, and the books she had carefully collected over the years. It had been a part of the home for as long as she could remember, but one day she came downstairs to find it replaced by a sleek, modern piece made of glass and metal. It looked elegant, but it felt cold. It didn't have the warmth and history that the old bookshelf had. Ellie didn't say anything, but the change hit her hard. It was as though they were slowly stripping away the evidence of her life, of the moments she had cherished, and replacing it with something that felt foreign. The bookshelf had been a symbol of her family's story, a reminder of the time they had spent together. But now, it seemed as though they were erasing that story bit by bit. Then there were the teacups, delicate porcelain cups that Ellie had inherited from her grandmother. They had always been on display in the kitchen, a reminder of the generations of women who had come before her. But one day, she went to make tea and found that they were gone. She asked Tessa where they had gone, but Tessa just smiled and said, "We donated them. We thought they were cluttering up the place." Ellie felt a sharp pang in her chest. Those teacups weren't just pieces of china. They were part of her history, part of the legacy she had passed down. And now, they were gone, just like that. It wasn't the value of the teacups that hurt. It was the sentimentality, the fact that they had been part of the home for so long and had held so many memories. To Tessa, they were just clutter. To Ellie, they were a link to her past, to the women who had shaped her. And then there was the garden bench, Harold's favorite spot in the garden, the place where he had spent countless afternoons reading, relaxing, and watching the seasons change. It had always been a special place for Ellie, too, a spot where she would sit and reflect on her life and her family. But one day, it was gone. Ellie asked Ben about it, and he simply said, "We replaced it with something more modern. It fits better with the new design." Ellie didn't argue. She didn't want to cause a scene, but in her heart, she knew that the bench wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a symbol of Harold, of their life together, and of the memories they had shared. And now, it was gone, replaced with something that had no meaning to her, something that didn't hold the same emotional weight. As these small changes continued to accumulate, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was happening. It wasn't just about the furniture or the decor, it was about her place in the family. She had given this house to Ben, but it was as if they were trying to erase her from the narrative entirely. She began to wonder whether her role in their lives was becoming obsolete, whether she was being quietly pushed out, not with loud arguments or confrontations, but with subtle, dismissive gestures. Ellie had always prided herself on being a supportive, loving mother. She had always put her family first, even when it meant sacrificing her own needs. But now, she began to realize that her presence in the family was no longer valued the way it once had been. Her contributions, whether it was cooking meals, folding laundry, or simply being there, were no longer seen as important. She wasn't needed anymore, and that, more than anything, hurt. The house, once filled with the warmth of family and memories, now felt cold. The walls, which had once echoed with laughter and love, now seemed to hold an uncomfortable silence. Ellie tried to ignore it, to convince herself that everything would work out, that Ben and Tessa would come to appreciate her again. But deep down, she knew something had changed. The home she had built, the place that had been the center of her life, was no longer hers. In a quiet moment of reflection, Ellie realized that it wasn't just the house that was changing. It was her relationship with Ben. She had always been there for him, always supported him. But now it seemed like he was pulling away. She had given him everything, but in return, she was being quietly erased from his life. And as much as she tried to deny it, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of displacement she felt. But even as the changes continued, Ellie held on to one thing: the unfinished deed. It was her last link to the home, the last piece of ownership she had in a place that was slowly slipping away from her. She didn't know what to do with it, but she knew it was something she could hold on to, a reminder that, despite everything, she still had a claim to the house. And that small, quiet act of holding on to what was rightfully hers would become the key to reclaiming not just the house, but her sense of self. The slow erosion of presence. As the days passed, Ellie could no longer deny the overwhelming feeling that her place in the family was being quietly dismantled, piece by piece. It wasn't the loud, dramatic kind of dismissal she had expected, but the slow, insidious kind, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but nonetheless painful. The house that had once been her sanctuary, the place where she had poured so much love, was transforming into a space that no longer felt like hers. The changes weren't just physical, they were emotional, and in many ways they felt like an erasure of everything she had ever been to her family. At first, Ellie tried to push away the nagging thoughts. She told herself that it was just a matter of time, that everything would go back to normal. She kept thinking that Ben and Tessa would remember who she was, that they would see her for the mother and wife she had always been. But each passing day, with its subtle shifts and small adjustments, seemed to take her further away from the life she had known. One morning, Ellie woke up to a surprise she hadn't expected. Ben had begun referring to the house as his house, no longer their house or Ellie's house. She hadn't said anything at first. It was a casual comment, something that could have easily been overlooked. But the more she thought about it, the more it stung. The family home, the place where she had raised him, was no longer a shared space. It was his alone. He had removed her from the equation without even realizing it, and somehow that hurt more than anything else. Ellie tried to remind him gently, "You mean the family home, don't you?" Ben had smiled and nodded, as if she had made a mistake, as though her correction was a cute quirk. It felt like a slap in the face, but she didn't react. She had learned to keep her feelings to herself over the years, to swallow her hurt and keep the peace. But now it was becoming harder and harder to ignore the truth. She wasn't part of their new life anymore, not really. She was just a ghost in the background, a forgotten character in a story she had once helped write. The changes continued, each one more hurtful than the last. Ellie had always been the one to keep the family together, to make sure everyone felt loved and included. She had been the one to organize family dinners, to make sure everyone was taken care of. But now it was as though they had stopped seeing her altogether. She wasn't needed, and that realization hit her harder than she could have imagined. It wasn't just the house that was changing, it was the dynamic within the family. Ellie had always thought that by giving her love and support freely, she would eventually be appreciated. But now she was beginning to see that sometimes love wasn't enough. It couldn't shield her from being pushed aside. Ben and Tessa were making it clear with every small change that she no longer had a place in their lives. They had already decided that she didn't belong, and they didn't even have the courtesy to tell her. Even the simple act of making meals, which had once been her way of contributing to the family, no longer seemed appreciated. When Ellie offered to cook, she was politely told that it wasn't necessary. Tessa would take over, or they'd order takeout. The kitchen, once a place where Ellie had poured her heart into cooking meals for her family, had become a space where she was no longer needed. Each dismissal, each quiet rejection, chipped away at Ellie's sense of self-worth. She was no longer the matriarch of the family. She was just a woman in the background, trying to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. The most painful realization came when Ellie overheard Ben and Tessa talking one evening. She had been sitting in the living room folding laundry when she heard their laughter from the other room. Ben had said something about how it felt strange to have the house so quiet in the mornings now. Tessa, always quick with her responses, had replied, "Well, it helps when she stays upstairs." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow, though they were said lightly, almost casually, as if they weren't important. But they were important. They were a reminder that she was no longer welcome in the family space, not in the way she had been before. It wasn't just the way they spoke of her, it was the way they treated her. Ellie had always been the one to create warmth in the home, to make it feel like a place of love and comfort. But now it felt like a hollow shell, a place that had been stripped of its soul. Ben and Tessa had their own vision of what the house should be, and Ellie no longer fit into that vision. She wasn't needed. She wasn't wanted. And that hurt more than any argument ever could. As the days passed, Ellie began to withdraw further into herself. She spent more time in the attic, where she had been relegated. She didn't want to be around the constant reminders that she was no longer part of their life. But even in the attic, she could still hear the sounds of their laughter, their conversations, and their plans. It was as if they were living in a world without her, a world where she no longer existed. Ellie knew deep down that something had to change. She had given everything for this family, her love, her time, her energy, but now it was clear that they were taking it all for granted. She had been quietly erased, pushed aside in favor of their new life, their new vision. But as painful as it was, Ellie realized that the only way forward was to reclaim what was rightfully hers. Not just the house, but her dignity, her place in the world. She was more than just a silent observer in her own life. She had to remember that. The first major break, Thanksgiving, 2019. Thanksgiving had always been a time of gathering for Ellie, a time for family, food, and shared memories. For years, she had been the one to plan the meal, to set the table, and to ensure that everyone felt at home. The smell of roasting turkey, the scent of cinnamon and cloves in the air, and the laughter that echoed through the house were all part of the warmth that Ellie had created. Thanksgiving wasn't just a holiday. It was a tradition, a ritual, a reflection of the love she had poured into her family. But in 2019, everything changed. Ellie had been looking forward to Thanksgiving, hoping that this year would be no different from the others. She had planned to cook the turkey, the cranberry sauce, the stuffing, and of course, the pecan pie that Harold had loved so much. She imagined the house full of guests, laughter spilling from the dining room, and everyone sitting down together to enjoy the meal she had spent days preparing. For Ellie, Thanksgiving was about more than just the food. It was about bringing the family together, making everyone feel welcome, and sharing the love that had been passed down through generations. But when the moment finally arrived, Ellie felt a shift in the air. It wasn't just the cold Vermont morning or the quiet rustle of leaves outside. It was something deeper, something that had been growing for months but had never been so evident until that moment. As Ellie stood in the kitchen preparing the meal, Ben casually mentioned that Tessa had planned something different for Thanksgiving that year. "Oh, Tessa's planning something more modern this year," he said, with a nonchalant shrug. "We were thinking of a Friendsgiving instead of the usual family dinner." Ellie's heart sank. A Friendsgiving? It wasn't just the fact that it wasn't the family gathering she had always cherished. It was the way it felt like an afterthought, as if the family she had built and nurtured no longer mattered. She tried to hide her disappointment, but it was hard to ignore. Ben and Tessa weren't even planning to have a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. The thought of missing out on the familiar dishes, the shared memories of past meals, and the family unity that had always been the cornerstone of the holiday was too much to bear. As if that wasn't enough, Tessa added, "We're planning to invite a few of my colleagues. It'll be a lot more casual, you know, no turkey or anything like that. You're welcome to join if you want, Ellie, of course." Ellie could hardly contain her shock. Of course, she thought bitterly. She had always been the one to prepare the Thanksgiving meal, the one who made sure everyone felt welcome. And now, she was being invited not as a central part of the celebration, but as an afterthought, a guest in her own home. It was as if they had made the decision without her, as though she had no say in what should have been the most important meal of the year. Ellie nodded silently, trying to hide the hurt that was quickly settling in her chest. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for explanations. She simply did what she always did. She kept quiet, went along with it, and hoped that things would improve. But deep inside, she knew that this wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about the growing distance between her and her family, the growing chasm that she could no longer ignore. That evening, after dinner, Ellie went up to her attic room, where she had been spending more and more of her time lately. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, now seemed empty, even though Ben and Tessa were just downstairs. The hum of the space heater in the attic was the only sound that filled the air, and as Ellie sat there, she couldn't help but feel like a ghost in her own home. The next morning, Ellie overheard a conversation between Tessa and Ben. It was a casual exchange, but the words hit Ellie hard. Tessa was on the phone, and Ellie could hear snippets of the conversation as she made her way down the stairs. "No, she's still here," Tessa said, her voice light but tinged with something else. "I know, Ben's trying to ease her out gently. Maybe after the holidays, we'll look into real estate options. Assisted living or something like that." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The words were like a slap. She stood there, frozen in place, unable to move or speak. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. The idea of sending her to assisted living, of pushing her out of the home she had built, had become a casual topic of discussion. Ellie closed her eyes, letting the words hit her like a blow. But even as the pain washed over her, something inside of her stirred. She had been erased from their lives, pushed out without a second thought. But she wasn't done yet. Later that day, Ellie went to the kitchen, trying to push the painful thoughts aside. She still baked, still made her famous cornbread, still kept the traditions alive because if she didn't, what would be left? She had always believed that motherhood, that giving, was sacred. She had spent her entire life ensuring that her family had what they needed, that they felt loved and cared for. She didn't know how to stop being needed, how to let go of the role she had always played. But the plate incident the next day changed everything. It happened during the Thanksgiving meal, what was supposed to be a casual gathering with Ben's colleagues and Tessa's friends. Ellie had tried to make the best of it. She walked to the buffet, reaching for the sweet potatoes as she always had, with a half smile on her face, trying to hold on to some semblance of normalcy. But as she scooped the spoon toward her plate, Ben reached over and took it from her hand. "I've got that," he said, his voice almost too sweet, as if doing her a favor, and then he leaned in and added, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "You don't live here anymore, remember?" Ellie's heart dropped. The words were low, meant only for her, but they were sharp and cutting. She froze, the plate slipping from her hand and falling to the floor with a clatter. The sound echoed through the room, breaking the silence that had settled around them. Ben stood there, spoon in hand, as if he had done her a favor. For a moment no one moved. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. Even Tessa, usually so poised, stood still, her smile frozen. The baby, who had been babbling happily just moments before, had stopped. Even the dog, which had been whining under the table, had gone silent. It was as though the whole world had stopped. Ellie bent down, picked up the plate, and walked slowly to the kitchen. Her legs were shaking, not from age, but from the realization that the humiliation she had felt wasn't a one-time thing. It was a pattern. They had been quietly erasing her for months, and this moment, was just the first time they hadn't bothered to hide it. She rinsed off the plate, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. Then, without saying a word, she went upstairs to her attic room. Her body trembled with the weight of what had just happened. But it wasn't the plate that had broken, it was something deeper inside her, something she hadn't even realized was still fragile. Realizing the erasure. The mudroom incident. The next few days after Thanksgiving were a blur for Ellie. The house, once filled with the warmth of family and love, now seemed colder, more distant. It wasn't just the absence of the familiar voices, it was the subtle ways in which she felt invisible, as though she had no place in the house she had poured her soul into. Every corner of the home seemed to remind her that she no longer mattered in the way she once had. Her presence was no longer woven into the very fabric of the place. Instead, she felt like a shadow, drifting through the halls, unnoticed, unimportant. The mudroom was one of the last spaces in the house that still felt like hers. It had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could store her gardening tools, her old coats, and the little things that grounded her. The mudroom had never been a glamorous part of the house. It was functional, unpretentious, and comforting in its simplicity. But now, as Ellie went to grab her gardening gloves from the mudroom one afternoon, she discovered yet another subtle change. The shelves that had once held her gardening gloves, the tools she had used for years to tend to the garden she and Harold had built together, were gone. In their place was a set of pristine, white, minimalist cabinetry, with labeled jars filled with tiny items that looked more like decor than anything functional. There were no gloves, no tools, no signs of the life Ellie had once lived there. It was as though her presence, her hobbies, and the memories of her life had been erased. The mudroom, once a symbol of her connection to the house, had been transformed into something impersonal, sterile, and unrecognizable. Ellie stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space. Her heart ached as she tried to process what she was seeing. The shelves had been replaced with something new, something that held no meaning to her. The gardening gloves, the tools those had been part of her. They were part of the woman she had been before everything had started changing. And now they were gone, replaced by something that didn't belong to her at all. She turned to Tessa, who had walked into the room while Ellie stood frozen in place. Tessa smiled brightly, as she always did, and explained with enthusiasm, "Oh, that clutter. We donated everything you hadn't used in a while. It's just, streamlining. We thought it would look better this way." Ellie could feel the tightness in her chest as she nodded slowly, fighting to keep her composure. It wasn't just the gardening gloves that had been taken, it was the essence of who she was, who she had been in this house. The gloves weren't just for gardening. They were a link to her past, to the life she had built in this home. And now, those little things that had once been hers were being slowly erased, piece by piece. What else could I say? Ellie thought to herself. She could have protested. She could have fought to keep the items that had been part of her for so long, but instead she chose silence. She said nothing and simply turned away. The truth was, she was beginning to understand that she didn't have a place here anymore. The home she had created, the memories she had nurtured, were no longer valued. It was as if she was a relic, something that no longer fit in the new vision of the house that Ben and Tessa were creating. The woman who had once been at the center of this family was now being slowly erased from the story. But still, Ellie didn't speak out. She didn't argue. She continued to hold on to what she could. She went back upstairs to her attic room, where she had spent more and more of her time, retreating into the quiet of that small space, away from the painful reminders of what she had lost. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want to make things more uncomfortable than they already were. So she stayed silent. But in the quiet of the attic, as she sat with her thoughts, Ellie couldn't ignore the reality of what was happening any longer. She had given everything for this family, for this house. And now it seemed as though she was being quietly pushed out, unnoticed, without a word of acknowledgement. It wasn't that Ben and Tessa were openly cruel or dismissive. They weren't shouting at her or telling her to leave. Instead, they were slowly, methodically erasing her presence in the house. They were replacing her, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the shell of the house, a house that no longer contained any trace of the woman who had built it, loved it, and made it her home. The slow, quiet erasure was the hardest part to bear. It wasn't the loud arguments or the accusations. It was the silence, the polite dismissals, the way her presence was gradually being made irrelevant. It was the way her identity was being rewritten, not with harsh words, but with small changes that chipped away at her sense of self. Ellie began to write things down. It wasn't because she was forgetful, it was because she needed to remember. She needed to hold on to the moments when she had felt important, when she had felt valued. She needed to record the small injustices, the ways in which she was being slowly pushed aside. Not because she was planning anything drastic, but because she had to remind herself that she hadn't imagined it all. The house, the memories, the love she had poured into this place, it was still real, even if Ben and Tessa seemed to be trying to rewrite it. The changes in the mudroom were just another chapter in Ellie's growing realization that she had been quietly erased. But they were also a catalyst for something else. As she sat in the attic, writing in her journal, Ellie began to understand something deep within herself. She couldn't control what Ben and Tessa were doing to the house. She couldn't change their actions. But what she could do was reclaim her own worth. She could remember who she was, what she had built, and who she had been to this family. And no matter how much they tried to erase her, she was not going to let them erase her from the story of her own life. The attic, a symbol of displacement. By the time Ellie had retreated to the attic, she had begun to feel like a stranger in her own life. The attic, once a place for storing old coats, vinyl records, and holiday decorations, had become a symbol of her displacement. It wasn't just a room in the house. It had become a physical representation of what had happened to her over the past few months, pushed into a corner, forgotten, and left to gather dust. The attic had always been a bit of a storage area, a place to store things that weren't needed every day but still held meaning. But now, Ellie's belongings seemed to be the only things left in the attic. Tessa had repurposed the guest suite on the first floor for her own use. Ellie had been moved upstairs, as if she were a visitor in her own home, and the attic, once just a temporary storage space, had become her permanent residence. The bed in the attic was a cot, uncomfortable and uneven, not the cozy space it used to be. Ellie had once been proud of the guest suite. She had contributed to its renovation with Harold, picking out window trim and choosing the lilac wallpaper, a soft, welcoming color that made it feel like a real part of the house. But now, all those touches were gone. The space she had once helped create had been taken away, leaving her with the barest of accommodations, in a room that didn't feel like home. Ellie tried to make the best of it. She told herself it was just temporary, that things would get better. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just about the room. It was about being moved out of her place in the family, being pushed aside in favor of Tessa's vision of what the house should be. Everything she had contributed to the home, from the renovations to the memories, seemed to be fading into the background, replaced by something more modern, more streamlined, more new. The attic, now her only space, felt like a prison, a place where she was no longer needed. It was a far cry from the house she had once filled with love and warmth, a home where she had raised Ben and shared countless moments with Harold. The changes weren't just superficial, they were emotional. The house had become a place where Ellie's presence was no longer welcome, and the attic was the final evidence of that. It wasn't just the physical distance that hurt, it was the emotional distance that Ben and Tessa had created. Ellie tried to maintain her dignity. She didn't confront them. She didn't argue. She accepted the changes because, for so long, she had believed that her place in the family was secure, that her role as mother and matriarch would always be valued. But she had been wrong. Ben and Tessa had started their own life, one that didn't include her in the way it once had. She wasn't part of their new vision of the home, and the attic, with its creaky floors and cold insulation, was the space they had relegated her to. Still, Ellie didn't let herself fully collapse into bitterness. She was a woman of strength, a woman who had spent years holding the family together, making sure everyone felt loved, making sure everything ran smoothly. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions in check, to do what needed to be done without demanding recognition. But now, as she sat in the dim light of the attic, staring out the window at the garden below, she realized that something inside her had shifted. The house that had once been a place of joy, of love, of family, now felt like a battleground. And yet, Ellie wasn't ready to give up. She wasn't ready to disappear quietly into the background. She had always fought for her family, always given everything she had, but she had never asked for anything in return. Now, however, she knew that the time had come for her to fight for something she hadn't even realized she needed: herself. Ellie spent the next few days in quiet reflection. She spent hours sitting in the attic, looking out at the garden, and thinking about everything that had happened. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about her place in the world, her right to be seen and respected. The attic, as much as it symbolized her displacement, also represented the space she could reclaim. She had been pushed to the margins, yes, but she wasn't going to stay there. She was still here, still alive, still worthy of recognition. One afternoon, Ellie made a decision. She wasn't going to stay hidden away in the attic forever. She wasn't going to let herself be erased from her own life. She was going to take back what was hers not through confrontation or anger, but with quiet strength and purpose. The house had been built on her love, her hard work, her sacrifices. It was time for her to take back her place in it. Ellie knew that reclaiming her space wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't happen overnight, and it wouldn't come without resistance. Ben and Tessa had already made up their minds about her, and they had already begun to rewrite the story of the house and the family. But Ellie was done waiting for them to see her. She was going to take action. It was time for her to stand tall and remind them that the house, the family, the memories, all of it had been built on her, and she wasn't going to let them erase that. In the attic, with the sunlight streaming through the small window, Ellie made a promise to herself. She would no longer stay silent. She would no longer be the quiet, invisible figure in the background. She would reclaim her worth, her legacy, and her place in the home she had created. No matter what it took, she would find a way to remind herself and them that she still mattered. A quiet rejection. The Thanksgiving plate incident. It was supposed to be a casual Thanksgiving meal, one that was different, modern even. But as Ellie entered the dining room that evening, the weight of the change felt almost suffocating. The house, once a place of shared history and warmth, had turned into something unfamiliar, and she could feel the coldness in the air. It had started subtly, this shift. But now, as Ellie glanced around the room, it was as though the very essence of what Thanksgiving had meant to her was no longer a part of it. Gone were the familiar dishes she had spent years perfecting. Gone were the traditions she had worked so hard to uphold. In their place were new faces, strangers to her, all gathered around the table that was once filled with her family. The dinner was more like a performance than a family meal, each detail meticulously curated. Tessa had taken charge of the menu, opting for trendy, Friendsgiving fare. Ellie had offered to cook, as she always had, but her offer was dismissed with a polite smile. It wasn't about the food, it was about control, about shaping this family moment into something that felt more modern and fresh, something that didn't include Ellie in the way she had always been. But Ellie wasn't angry. She wasn't screaming or demanding that things return to the way they used to be. Instead, she chose to stay quiet, to observe from the sidelines, as though she had no right to be a part of this family's celebration. She could feel it in the way Ben avoided eye contact with her, in the way Tessa spoke to her with that forced sweetness. They had already made it clear she was no longer necessary. And then came the moment that would stay with Ellie forever. As she approached the buffet, her hands trembling slightly, she reached for the spoon to serve herself some sweet potatoes. She had made this dish for years, always just the way everyone liked it, comforting, warm, a symbol of the many Thanksgivings she had hosted. But just as she lifted the spoon to place it on her plate, Ben stepped forward and snatched it out of her hand. "I've got that," he said, his voice light, but with a subtle edge to it. "Let me help you." Ellie's heart sank. She had been reduced to a guest, an outsider in her own home. The words that followed, spoken low so only she could hear, sent a sharp pain through her chest. "You don't live here anymore, remember?" Ellie froze. The plate slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the room. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The laughter, the chatter, everything in the room came to a sudden halt. The world seemed to shrink down to that one moment, her humiliation, her realization that she had been erased from this family's life. Ben stood there, spoon still in hand, looking as though he had just done her a favor. He didn't apologize. He didn't seem to understand the weight of what had just happened. And Ellie didn't know how to respond. Words escaped her. Instead, she bent down, picked up the plate, and quietly walked away. The room remained still, suspended in that moment of discomfort, while Ellie disappeared into the kitchen. As she rinsed off the plate, the water running over her fingers, Ellie's mind raced. How had it come to this? How had she become the invisible woman in her own home, a house that had once been full of life, love, and laughter? How had Ben, her own son, so easily turned his back on her and treated her like she didn't belong? The question gnawed at her, but no answers came. Her legs shook as she returned to her attic room. The humiliation, the anger, and the sadness all mixed together in a tight knot in her chest. She had given everything to her family, her time, her love, her efforts, and this was how she was repaid, with cold indifference, with polite dismissal, with being made to feel like a stranger in her own home. But Ellie wasn't broken. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just sat in the stillness of the attic, trying to process the reality of the moment. There was no explosion, no dramatic confrontation. There didn't need to be. Ellie had spent too many years keeping things together, keeping the peace, for it to end in a burst of anger. No, this was something deeper, something that couldn't be fixed with a few harsh words. It wasn't the plate that had broken, it was her sense of place, her sense of self-worth. But it wasn't gone. She wasn't gone. The pain Ellie felt wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a sign that she was still alive, still capable of feeling, still worthy of being seen. The house, the memories, everything she had poured into that space wasn't gone. It was just buried under the weight of Ben and Tessa's disregard. And Ellie wasn't going to let them bury her. The next day, as she sat in the attic, Ellie made a decision. She would no longer be silent. She would no longer let herself be erased, quietly dismissed and pushed aside. The woman who had once been the heart of this family, the woman who had built this house with love and sacrifice, would find a way to reclaim her place. She wasn't going to fight with anger or resentment. She wasn't going to scream for attention. No, Ellie knew she had the power to take back what was hers, and she would do it on her own terms. The slow erosion of her presence in the family was coming to an end. Ellie was done being invisible. It was time for her to stand up, to be seen, and to remind Ben and Tessa that they couldn't simply erase her from the story. The house she had created, the life she had lived, was hers to reclaim, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget that. The moment of clarity. Reclaiming her worth. Ellie sat in the quiet of the attic, the weight of her decision slowly sinking in. It wasn't just about the house anymore, nor was it solely about Ben and Tessa's treatment of her. This was about her reclaiming her worth. She had spent years quietly accepting her role as the background, as the one who gave and gave without expecting anything in return. But something in her had finally shifted. The moment when Ben had snatched the plate from her hand wasn't just a moment of humiliation. It was the catalyst for a profound realization. She could no longer stay silent. She could no longer allow herself to be pushed aside. Ellie had always been the one who held the family together, the one who made sure everyone felt loved and cared for. She had spent years ironing shirts, making meals, and nurturing everyone around her. But in return, what had she received? She had been erased from the family's story, made to feel invisible, as if her love and sacrifices had no value. The more Ellie thought about it, the more she realized that she wasn't angry, at least not in the way one would expect. Her anger wasn't about Ben or Tessa. It wasn't about the plate or the changes they had made to the house. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried under years of selflessness. It was about her reclaiming the part of herself she had long forgotten, the part of her that deserved respect, that deserved to be seen. As the days passed, Ellie began to take small, quiet steps toward reclaiming her space in the house, not through confrontation, but through deliberate action. She didn't want to fight, not with words or loud demands. What she wanted was to remind herself of who she was, of the woman who had built this family and this house. She started by writing things down in her journal, not just the moments of hurt, but the good memories, the triumphs, the love she had given. It wasn't a plan for revenge. It was a way of reminding herself that she mattered. Ellie knew that the changes in the house weren't just about furniture or decor. They were about her place in the family. Ben and Tessa had made it clear that they wanted to reshape the house, to make it something that suited their vision. But Ellie knew that the house was more than just a space. It was filled with memories, with the love and effort she had poured into it. And those memories couldn't be erased, no matter how hard they tried. She started by taking small actions. She reclaimed the kitchen. Every morning she would go downstairs and make her coffee, as she always had. The house, once so full of activity and warmth, had become eerily silent when she was relegated to the attic. But Ellie wouldn't let the silence define her. She made sure to fill the space with her presence again. She started baking, not for anyone else, but for herself. She remembered how much she had loved making pies, baking cornbread, and filling the house with the smell of fresh-baked goods. The kitchen was hers, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. It wasn't just the kitchen either. Ellie began to take back the small things that had been taken from her. The teacups, the bookshelf, the garden bench, they all held meaning for her. She didn't need to argue with Ben and Tessa. She didn't need their approval. She just needed to remind herself of her worth, of the woman she had been, and the woman she still was. But the most significant step Ellie took was with the deed. She had never signed the final transfer of the house to Ben. It had been a precaution, a small act of self-preservation that she had long forgotten about. But as she sat in the attic, reflecting on everything that had happened, Ellie realized that the unfinished deed was the key to reclaiming her power. She didn't need to wait for Ben and Tessa's approval. She didn't need to beg for their respect. She had the power to take back what was hers, legally and emotionally. Ellie reached out to Deborah, her old friend and lawyer. Deborah had always been there for her, a quiet but steady presence in her life. They met, and together they started to build a case to reclaim the house. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Deborah helped Ellie gather evidence of the ways she had been pushed out, the small moments of disrespect, the attempts to erase her from the family's story. Ellie wasn't doing this to punish anyone. She wasn't doing it out of spite. She was doing it because she had finally realized her worth, because she could no longer allow herself to be erased. She wasn't just the woman who had built the house. She wasn't just the mother who had raised her son. She was Ellie Cooper. And she had a right to be seen and respected. As the legal process began, Ellie remained calm. She didn't make grand speeches or confrontations. She simply took action. She took back what was hers, quietly and resolutely. She wasn't going to let anyone diminish her anymore. By the time Deborah had finalized the legal paperwork, Ellie had already started to feel a shift in herself. The house, the memories, and the legacy were still hers. She had never truly given them away, and now, with a few simple actions, she was beginning to reclaim them. Ellie wasn't doing this to make Ben and Tessa feel guilty. She wasn't doing it to destroy their plans or their vision. She was doing it for herself. She was doing it because, after years of giving, she deserved to feel like she mattered. She deserved to feel like she belonged in the home she had built. And as the days passed and Ellie began to reclaim her space, something unexpected happened. Ben, who had once been so distant, came to her one evening. He held a photo of them together from when he was a child, her holding him in front of the rose bushes they had planted together. "I found this," Ben said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. I didn't realize how much of this house is you." Ellie looked at him, the boy she had raised, the man who had become so distant. "I know," she replied softly, "but it's not too late." It wasn't too late for them to rebuild their relationship, to start over. It wasn't too late for Ellie to reclaim her place, not just in the house, but in the family. And as the legal papers were signed and the deed was transferred back to her, Ellie stood tall, no longer invisible, no longer erased. The house was hers again, but more importantly, she was hers again. She was not just the woman who had been pushed aside. She was the woman who had reclaimed her place in the world, in her family, and in the home she had built with love and determination. The deed, the key to her power. The day Ellie received the legal documents from Deborah was a quiet one. The morning light filtered through the small attic window, casting a soft glow on the cluttered space that had become her temporary home. The papers that Deborah had sent were more than just legal documents. They were the embodiment of Ellie's reclamation. As she looked at them, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. The battle she had fought, even if it had been a quiet one, was now official. The house was hers again. Ellie had known that there was always a possibility of regaining control of the home. The unfinished deed, the one she had never signed all those years ago, had always been her safety net, the lifeline she had kept tucked away, almost forgotten. It was a small gesture, one that had seemed insignificant at the time, but it was one that would ultimately prove to be her salvation. She had never meant for things to go this far. She hadn't intended to force Ben and Tessa out of the house, nor had she planned to take legal action. All she had wanted was to be seen, to be valued, and to be recognized for the contributions she had made. But the moment when Ben had told her, with a detached smile, "You don't live here anymore, remember?" had shattered something in her. It was the moment she realized that she was no longer an integral part of the family, and that realization sparked something deep inside her, a quiet but firm resolve to reclaim her worth. The house had been built on love. It had been built with the sweat and tears of not just herself, but also Harold, the man she had spent her life with. They had poured their hearts into the structure, making it a home. And when she had handed it over to Ben, it had been with the intention of passing on that legacy. She never expected that love and history would be so easily overlooked, erased, and replaced. But as she sat with the legal documents in front of her, Ellie felt a surge of strength. This wasn't about vengeance. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about remembering who she was. It was about reclaiming her space in the world, her legacy, and the family she had built. The deed was the key to that. Deborah had done more than just provide legal advice. She had become a quiet ally in Ellie's journey to reclaim her life. As the lawyer explained the next steps in the process, Ellie's thoughts drifted back to everything that had led her here. She thought about the years of sacrifice, the moments of quiet pain, and the love that had never been truly acknowledged. She thought about the changes in the house, the subtle erasure of her presence, and the gradual shifting of her role within her family. But most of all, Ellie thought about the strength she had always carried within her. It wasn't the kind of strength that made a loud noise or demanded attention. It was the quiet kind, the kind that built a home from the ground up, the kind that stayed even when the world seemed to be pushing her out. And now, Ellie was standing in the quiet space of her own power. She had spent so many years thinking that love and sacrifice were enough to keep her place in her family. But she had learned that sometimes love isn't enough to hold on to what's yours. Sometimes you have to take a step back and remind everyone, most importantly, yourself, of what you're worth. As the documents were finalized, Ellie took a deep breath and held the papers in her hands. They were more than just a legal tool. They were a symbol of her strength, her resilience, and her right to be seen. She had been patient for so long. She had given freely without expecting anything in return. But now, Ellie knew that she couldn't keep waiting for others to recognize her value. She couldn't keep letting her contributions be dismissed or erased. It was time for her to stand tall, to reclaim what had always been hers, and to remind her family of the legacy she had built. For so long, she had been the one who kept things together, who held the family together. She had never asked for anything in return. But now, Ellie understood that it wasn't selfish to reclaim her worth. It was an act of self-preservation, an acknowledgement of her own value. As she left Deborah's office, the weight of the documents in her bag felt strangely light. The next step was simple: to move forward. She had already made the decision. The house, the memories, the legacy, everything she had built was still there. She had never truly given it away. The legal battle wasn't over, but Ellie knew that it didn't matter. She had already won. The act of reclaiming her power, of remembering who she was enough. And with each passing day, as she began to rebuild her life, She would continue to remind herself that she was more than just a guest in her own story. She was the author of it, and no one could take that away from her. As Ellie walked back to the house, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a peace born from winning or from taking something back. It was the peace that came from finally understanding her worth, from knowing that she could no longer be invisible, no longer be erased. She had been the heartbeat of this family, the foundation of this home, and she was going to take her place in it once again. Meeting Deborah, the lawyer and ally. The decision to seek legal advice wasn't one Ellie had come to lightly. She had spent years nurturing her family, giving them everything she had and asking for nothing in return. The idea of having to take such a drastic step felt foreign to her. But Deborah, her old colleague from the university library, who had turned to law in her later years, had always been someone Ellie trusted. She wasn't just an attorney, she was a friend, someone who had supported Ellie during difficult times. When Ellie called her, she knew she had found someone who would stand by her, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who understood the nuances of her life. Deborah had always been sharp, perceptive, and empathetic qualities that Ellie needed now more than ever. She had known Ellie long enough to understand the weight of her quiet strength, to see the hurt that Ellie had been carrying for years without voicing it. Deborah's expertise in elder rights was invaluable, but it was her kindness and understanding that made all the difference. When Ellie sat down in Deborah's office for their first meeting, she didn't expect much, just some legal advice, a few steps she could take to regain control of her home. But as Deborah pulled out the file, Ellie realized how much this process would change her. For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt like someone was truly listening to her. The weight she had carried in silence for so long began to lift, and she felt a flicker of hope, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel for years. Deborah didn't waste time with pleasantries. She got straight to the point, explaining the legal steps they could take to ensure that Ellie regained ownership of the house. They went over the unfinished deed, the one Ellie had left unsigned years ago, not because she didn't trust Ben, but because she had learned over time that love wasn't always enough to protect you from being erased. It was a detail that Ellie had almost forgotten, buried under years of giving and sacrificing. But now it was the key to her reclamation. As Deborah spoke, Ellie felt a sense of clarity wash over her. She had been so focused on doing everything for others, on making sure everyone around her felt loved and cared for, that she had forgotten to care for herself. She had forgotten that she, too, deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged, and to be respected. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of everything she had built, everything she had worked for. And no one had the right to take that away from her, not even her own son. "Ellie," Deborah said gently, pulling her out of her thoughts, "this is about more than just legal ownership. It's about reclaiming your life. You've given so much, and now it's time for you to take back what's yours, not just legally, but emotionally." Ellie nodded, the tears she had been holding back threatening to spill. She had spent so long waiting for Ben and Tessa to recognize her, to see the sacrifices she had made. But she realized now that recognition wasn't something she could wait for. She had to take it for herself. And if that meant using the law to reclaim her rightful place in the house, then so be it. Deborah continued, outlining the steps Ellie would need to take, gathering evidence, documenting every conversation and instance where her presence had been minimized, and preparing for the legal proceedings that would follow. It wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be easy, but Ellie felt a sense of resolve settle in her chest. She wasn't alone in this. Deborah had her back, and for the first time in a long while, Ellie felt like she had the power to take control of her own life again. The meeting lasted hours, but by the time Ellie walked out of Deborah's office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, no doubt, but Ellie had made the decision to reclaim what had been hers all along, and she wasn't going to back down. As she left the office and stepped into the crisp Vermont air, Ellie felt the weight of the past few months lift. She wasn't just reclaiming a house. She was reclaiming her dignity, her identity, and the space she had once held so proudly. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but Ellie was ready. She had the strength, the resolve, and the support she needed. And she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Ben and Tessa, take away what was rightfully hers. Ellie's thoughts turned to the house as she drove back. She imagined it the rooms that had once been full of laughter, the kitchen where she had baked pies for Thanksgiving, the garden where she had planted roses with Harold. It was still her home, and no one, not even her own son, could take that away from her. She would fight for it, not just because it was a house, but because it represented everything she had built, everything she had loved. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She was no longer invisible. Ellie had reclaimed her power, and this time she wasn't backing down. Fighting back in silence, the quiet preparations. Ellie's decision to take back control of her life, and the house wasn't just a matter of fighting for ownership, it was about rediscovering herself. For so many years, she had been the one who quietly gave, who stood in the background, ensuring everything ran smoothly. But now, as she sat in her attic room, the final legal documents on the horizon, Ellie realized that this was her time to step forward. The legal battle would not be noisy or filled with conflict. Instead, Ellie would reclaim her space through quiet strength, through her actions and her refusal to fade away. The preparations were not just legal, they were emotional. Ellie didn't need to shout her intentions to Ben and Tessa. She didn't need to demand their attention or force them to acknowledge her. She had already given so much of herself, and now it was her turn to take back her place. As she started preparing for the legal process, she didn't rush. She allowed herself time to reflect, to process everything that had led her here, and to remind herself of her worth. Ellie kept a journal. It had started out as a way of recording the small dismissals, the moments when she felt invisible. But as time went on, it became more. She documented her memories of the house the first time she painted the kitchen, the day Ben took his first steps, the way Harold used to laugh in the living room. Those memories were hers. No one could take them away. And in documenting them, Ellie realized how much of herself she had forgotten, how much of her own life had been relegated to the background. She wrote down conversations she had overheard, like the one where Ben and Tessa had casually discussed sending her to assisted living, as though it were an afterthought. She wrote down the moment Ben had told her with a quiet smile, "You don't live here anymore, remember?" It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the realization that she had been erased from the narrative, pushed aside as though she had no place in the family she had built. But Ellie was done being erased. The journal became her anchor. As she prepared for the legal steps ahead, she used it to keep track of everything. She wrote down the small dismissals, the times her presence was ignored, the moments when her heart had broken and she had chosen to remain silent. But she also wrote down the things that mattered, the way the sun used to filter through the windows on Sunday mornings, the way Harold's laughter echoed in the hall, the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. These were her memories, and they were not going anywhere. Ellie knew that Ben and Tessa had already moved on. They had already made their decisions about her place in the family, but she couldn't control that. What she could control was how she saw herself. She was not a victim of their neglect. She was not a woman who had been forgotten. She was the woman who had built this house with her own hands, the one who had raised Ben, loved Harold, and kept the family together. The legal preparations were methodical. Deborah had laid out the steps clearly, but Ellie didn't rush through them. She knew it would take time. She wasn't looking for quick revenge. What she wanted was something deeper, a quiet reclaiming of her worth, her dignity, and the space she had once held so proudly. The paperwork, the evidence, the trail of dismissals, it was all important. But more than that, it was a symbol of her strength, her quiet determination. As the days passed and the preparations continued, Ellie allowed herself to reflect on the person she had been before she had been pushed aside. She remembered the woman who had once cooked meals for her family, who had stayed up late helping Ben with his homework, who had worked tirelessly to make the house a home. That woman was still here. She hadn't disappeared, no matter how much Ben and Tessa might have wanted her to. One of the most painful moments Ellie had experienced in this process was realizing that Ben had started referring to the house as his house, no longer their house. It was a small comment, something that could have been easily dismissed, but to Ellie, it was the clearest sign that she had been pushed aside, erased from the story of the family she had once shaped. And yet, in that moment, Ellie didn't feel anger. She felt clarity. She had given so much, but she was not going to continue giving when no one acknowledged her. She had poured everything into this family, but now it was time for her to focus on herself. The quiet preparations Ellie made were more than just legal steps. They were acts of self-care, of reminding herself that she still mattered, that she still had value. She was preparing for the moment when she would stand in her power once again, not as a victim, but as the woman who had always been the heart of the family. Ellie had always known how to keep the family together, how to make sure everyone felt seen, even when she had been invisible to herself. But now, as she moved forward with her quiet preparations, Ellie knew that the time for being invisible was over. She was not going to fight with loud words or gestures. Instead, she would take action, quiet, deliberate, and steady. She was going to reclaim her place, not by shouting, but by reminding everyone, most importantly, herself, that she had always belonged, and the first step was already underway. The house, the memories, and the life she had built it was all still hers, and Ellie wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The legal blow, serving the papers. Ellie had spent weeks preparing, gathering the evidence she needed to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She had documented the small dismissive moments, the times when she had been slowly pushed out of her own home, all the while quietly steeling herself for the confrontation she had long avoided. It wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about anger. It was about reclaiming her space, her dignity, and the life she had built. She knew it would take time and patience, but Ellie had always been patient. The difference now was that she was no longer patient with being invisible. The moment had come. Deborah, her trusted lawyer, had carefully prepared the legal papers. Ellie had spent hours reviewing them, going over the evidence one more time, ensuring everything was in place. And now, it was time for the next step. She had made the decision. She would serve the papers to Ben herself. Ellie wasn't expecting a dramatic confrontation. She didn't want an argument. What she wanted was clarity, a quiet, firm reminder that she was still part of the family, that the house they now inhabited was still hers, even if they had tried to erase her from it. There was no loud announcement, no confrontation in the living room. Instead, Ellie stood at the threshold of the home she had once filled with love, holding the envelope containing the legal documents that would change everything. The house, which had once been a place of joy and comfort, now felt cold. The familiar creaks in the floorboards seemed louder now, almost mocking her. Every step she took through the hallways reminded her of what had been lost, but also what could still be reclaimed. She knew she was doing the right thing. This wasn't about hurting Ben and Tessa. It was about protecting herself, about ensuring that her legacy was respected. As Ellie walked to the dining room, she saw Ben sitting at the table, his eyes focused on his phone. Tessa was in the kitchen, moving about the space with that air of ownership she had come to recognize all too well. She walked over to Ben, and without saying a word, she placed the envelope on the table in front of him. Ben looked up, confused. "What's this?" he asked, his voice flat, not yet recognizing the significance of what he was holding. "It's for you," Ellie said quietly, her voice steady but firm. "It's the deed. I never signed it, remember?" "Never." Ben glanced at the envelope, and for a brief moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He knew exactly what this was. He opened it, scanning the contents quickly, his eyes narrowing with each passing line. This says the house isn't mine," he said, his voice thick with disbelief. "You can't do this, Mom. We've been living here for years." Ellie took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, but she wasn't going to back down now. "You never owned it, Ben. she replied softly, but with the quiet authority that had always been there, even when she had been ignored. You had the house, yes, but it was never yours. And now, I'm reclaiming what's mine. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of Ben's shallow breathing as he tried to process what had just happened. He seemed to deflate, his shoulders sagging as though the realization of what had been done finally hit him. "Mom," Ben started, his voice softer now. "This is insane. After everything we've done for you." Ellie's gaze hardened slightly, but she didn't interrupt him. She had heard the same arguments for months now, the quiet justifications for why she had been pushed aside. But she wasn't listening anymore. She had listened for years, listened to their excuses, listened to their dismissals. But she wasn't going to listen anymore. "No, Ben," Ellie said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I've given everything. I've spent my life giving to this family, and now it's time for me to take something back." Tessa appeared in the doorway, overhearing the conversation. She seemed surprised, her posture stiffening as she glanced between Ellie and Ben. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with an almost imperceptible edge of defensiveness. Ellie looked at her, her expression softening. "I'm not kicking you out, Tessa, but I'm taking back what is mine. I'm reclaiming my space, my home. This house was built with love, with sacrifice, and it will always be a part of me." Tessa's lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes flickering with something Ellie couldn't quite read. She looked as though she might argue, but then she just nodded curtly and walked away, disappearing into the kitchen. Ben, however, remained where he was, the weight of the situation beginning to settle in. Ellie could see the conflict in his eyes. He didn't want to lose the house, didn't want to face the reality that everything he had taken for granted could be taken away. But Ellie knew, in that moment, that this was more than just about the house. It was about respect, about boundaries, and about ensuring that her contributions were acknowledged, not erased. "You could have just talked to us," Ben said finally, his voice quieter now, less sure of itself. "You didn't have to do this." Ellie shook her head. "I've tried talking, Ben, for years, but you weren't listening. You and Tessa made it clear that I don't belong here anymore. And if that's the case, then there's no place for me in the home you're trying to create. This is my home, and it always will be." Ben remained silent, staring at the envelope in his hands. Ellie didn't wait for him to respond. She didn't need his permission. She had already made her decision. As Ellie turned to leave, she couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. This wasn't about winning a battle. It was about reclaiming her place in her own life. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, Ellie felt like she was finally standing in her own power, no longer pushed to the margins of her own existence. The legal papers had been served, but more importantly, Ellie had made her presence undeniable once again. She was no longer invisible. She had fought quietly, steadily, and without anger. She had fought with dignity, and now she was ready for whatever came next. The shifting energy, the family's response. In the days following the delivery of the legal papers, Ellie noticed a distinct shift in the energy of the house. It wasn't immediate or loud. It wasn't the kind of upheaval one might expect after a dramatic confrontation. Instead, it was a quiet change, a subtle discomfort that lingered in the corners, in the pauses during conversation, in the way Ben and Tessa moved through the house. At first, Ellie couldn't quite place it. There was no outward anger, no confrontation, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. It was like walking into a room where everyone knows something is about to happen, but no one wants to acknowledge it. Ellie could sense it in the way Ben avoided making eye contact with her, the way Tessa's forced politeness had a little less sweetness in it. Even the house itself seemed to be holding its breath. Ellie's actions had clearly shaken something loose, and it was clear that Ben and Tessa were both grappling with the reality of what she had done. Ellie didn't expect them to understand right away, nor did she expect an immediate resolution. but she couldn't ignore the fact that, for the first time in years, the house felt alive again. It wasn't the life of a family united, but rather the energy of a family at a crossroads, one that would either break or rebuild. That afternoon, as Ellie was preparing lunch, she heard a knock at the door. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and for a moment she hesitated. But when she opened it, she was surprised to see Ben standing on the porch, his shoulders hunched, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked different than he had in days past, tired perhaps, or weighed down by something he hadn't fully processed. "Mom," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence between them. "Can we talk?" Ellie stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. She didn't say anything she didn't need to. She had already made her stance clear. But there was a part of her, a small part, that was still holding on to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, Ben would see things differently now. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one where Ellie had cooked so many meals for him over the years. It felt strangely distant now, like they were both strangers at the table. Ben began to speak, but he didn't look at her directly. Instead, he focused on his hands, his eyes darting back and forth between the table and the window. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for any of this, but I think I get it now." Ellie didn't rush him. She didn't push for a resolution, didn't try to force an apology out of him. She had learned long ago that real change couldn't be rushed. Ben had to come to his own realization, and she knew it would take time. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mom," Ben continued. "I didn't realize how much I was taking you for granted. All these years I just assumed you would always be here. I guess I was wrong." Ellie's heart ached, but she didn't let the emotion show on her face. This wasn't the time for tears. This was the moment she had been waiting for Ben to see her, not as a burden or a relic, but as a woman who deserved respect, who deserved to be acknowledged. "I wasn't asking for anything, Ben," Ellie said quietly, her voice steady. "I wasn't asking for your approval or your recognition. I just wanted to be seen, to be a part of the family again. But I can't keep pretending that I don't matter." Ben nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words was beginning to sink in. He shifted in his seat, looking at Ellie for the first time since he had entered the room. His eyes were no longer filled with frustration or anger, but with something softer, regret, perhaps, or a recognition that the family dynamics had shifted in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. I didn't know how to fix things," Ben admitted. "But I do know that this house, your house, isn't just mine. It's ours. It's always been yours." Ellie nodded, but her heart was still heavy. Words were one thing, but actions were another. She didn't need him to apologize, didn't need him to beg for her forgiveness. What Ellie needed was for Ben to understand that the power to restore the family wasn't just in his hands, it was in all of them. She had never asked for anything, but in that moment, she realized that asking for her place in the family was not a selfish act. It was an act of self-respect, and Ben needed to understand that too. "I've spent too long making sure everyone else was okay, Ben," Ellie said, her voice softer now. "I've spent too long ignoring my own needs, my own voice. But I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." The silence between them felt different now, less strained, less confrontational. For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt as though the walls around her were beginning to crumble, not because she had forced them, but because Ben was finally seeing the truth. I'll talk to Tessa," Ben said slowly, his voice uncertain. "We need to figure this out. We need to figure out how to move forward. Together." Ellie didn't respond immediately. She didn't know what moving forward would look like, but she knew it had to start somewhere. Perhaps this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where she was no longer the invisible mother, no longer the background figure in her own life. She was Ellie Cooper, the woman who had given everything to her family, the woman who still had a right to be seen. "I'm not asking for much," Ellie said finally, her voice calm. "Just for you to see me. Just for you to remember what I gave. That's all." Ben nodded again, slowly standing up from the table. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly, before walking out. Ellie sat back in her chair, a wave of emotion washing over her. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know what would happen with the house or with her relationship with Ben and Tessa. But for the first time in a long while, Ellie felt that she was no longer fighting alone. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life, and that was enough. Moving forward. A new kind of peace. In the weeks that followed the quiet exchange between Ellie and Ben, the dynamics in the house began to shift. The tension that had lingered in the air, thick and suffocating, started to dissipate, though the scars of the past remained. Ellie could feel it in the way Ben and Tessa moved through the house, in the way they spoke to her now, more cautiously, more aware of her presence. It was as if they had begun to understand the magnitude of her role in their lives, the sacrifices she had made, and the love she had poured into their family. Ellie had no illusions. The road ahead would not be easy, and things would not return to the way they once were. The memories of the quiet erasure, the way she'd been pushed aside, would not disappear overnight. But something had shifted, something that gave Ellie hope for the future. She wasn't asking for a perfect reconciliation, and she wasn't demanding that Ben and Tessa apologize for everything. What she wanted, what she needed, was for her presence in the family to be acknowledged, for the love and effort she had given to be seen and respected. And slowly, it seemed, they were beginning to see her again, not as a relic of the past, not as a burden, but as Ellie Cooper, the woman who had always been at the heart of this family. It was small gestures that began to make the difference. Ben started spending more time with her, sitting down for coffee in the mornings or helping her in the garden, something they hadn't done in years. Tessa, though still cautious, seemed to be softening, her forced politeness giving way to a more genuine warmth, though it was still wrapped in layers of hesitance. There were no grand declarations of love or apologies, but the small shifts, those were the things Ellie noticed. It was the way Ben would stop and ask her opinion about something, or how Tessa would bring her a cup of tea when she saw Ellie sitting alone. It was the quiet acknowledgement that Ellie still mattered. The house, too, began to feel different. It wasn't just a building anymore, it was a place of rebuilding, of rediscovery. Ellie had always known that a house was more than just walls and furniture. It was built on the memories, the laughter, and the love that filled it. But now, it felt like a space where healing could happen. The floors creaked with the weight of history, but they also seemed to hum with the possibility of new beginnings. Ellie began to reclaim parts of the house that had once been hers, her favorite armchair in the living room, the kitchen counter where she had spent countless hours cooking meals for her family, the garden where she had planted roses with Harold. These weren't just physical spaces. They were reminders of who she had been, who she still was. Slowly, she started making small changes too, adding her personal touch back into the rooms that had felt so foreign to her in recent months. She started baking again, not for anyone's approval, but because she loved it. She made pies for herself, the same pies she had once made for Thanksgiving, and the smell of cinnamon and sugar began to fill the house once more. In the quiet moments of reflection, Ellie allowed herself to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years: peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from everything being perfect, but the kind that came from knowing she had reclaimed her place not just in the house, but in her life. The quiet battles she had fought, the moments of hurt she had endured, had all led to this point. She was still here, still standing, still holding on to the love and memories that had built this family and this home. One evening, as she sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset over the garden, Ellie realized that she had come full circle. She had given everything to her family, and for a long time she had felt like she was losing herself in the process. But now she understood that giving didn't mean disappearing. It didn't mean losing herself in the process of loving others. It meant loving herself, too. Ellie knew there was still work to be done. There would be conversations to have, boundaries to set, and memories to rebuild. But as she sat in the quiet of her garden, the sound of crickets chirping in the distance, Ellie felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that the family she had once built with such care could be rebuilt. Hope that Ben, Tessa, and the house could once again become places of love and belonging. She wasn't going to erase the past, she couldn't, but she was going to shape the future, gently and with intention, just as she had always shaped her family's life. In the years to come, Ellie would continue to build, to love, and to give. But this time, she would do it for herself too. This time, she wouldn't fade into the background. She would stand at the center of her own story. And as she sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the garden and the quiet hum of the house, Ellie realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for. She had reclaimed her place, not through loud declarations or demands, but through quiet strength and determination. She had reminded herself of her worth, and in doing so, she had reminded those around her of the love and sacrifices that had built this family and this home. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, Ellie felt whole again, and that was enough. Through Ellie's story, we see that sometimes sacrifices and love are not fully appreciated, but everyone deserves to be valued. Take a moment to reflect on what you have in your life. If you find this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your loved ones or friends. And if you'd like to hear more inspiring stories like this one, be sure to hit like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any future videos.